Welcome to Chapter 6, Scale Economics, Imperfect Competition and Trade. What we're going to talk about in this chapter is really what a lot of economists now call the Krugman model. The Krugman model is a model of trade which uses increasing returns to scale. And it's typical of larger companies, or looking at industries as well that are that have some kind of product that's not homogeneous, so a heterogeneous product. Example of that might be the airline industry or the car industry, where a car is a car, yes, but there are different types of cars. A plane is a plane, yes, but there are different types of planes. At any rate, let's start off with the groundwork for the Krugman model. First of all, scale economies. Scale economies, we've got really two types of returns to scale, three types of returns to scale, I should say. Constant returns. And with constant returns to scale, input use and total cost rise in the same proportion as output increases. So in other words, if you're manufacturing a product and you double the inputs, you'll get double the outputs. That's constant returns to scale. Average cost there should be constant because, of course, the total cost divided by the number of units produced doesn't vary. It stays constant. Now, with increasing returns to scale, or what he calls scale economies, output quantity goes up by a larger proportion than total cost does as output increases. So if output quantity expands faster than total cost increases, then the average cost of producing a unit of output decreases as output increases. Now, this is typically the case because we have usually two types of cost. We have variable costs and fixed costs. With a fixed cost, that's kind of like the cost of a headquarters, cost of overhead, cost of a legal department, cost of an accounting department. That tends to be fixed for any business. And so the more you produce, the more you can spread that fixed cost over an increasing number of products, or increasing output. Another way of looking at this is in terms of the average cost curve. So if you have scale economies, then as you increase quantity produced, and you can see that on the horizontal axis, your average cost per unit falls. And you can see that falling from 26 to 23 to 21 to 20. Now, there are two types of scale economies. There's internal scale economies and external scale economies. Let's deal with each in turn. So for internal scale economies, the size of the individual firm matters. In other words, this is where you tend to get kind of what we call oligopolies, so larger companies that may be where there's just a few in each industry. This is clearly a different industry structure from perfect competition. So these are scale economies that derive from the size of the firm. So if these are things like fixed costs, then the bigger the firm is, presumably the more it produces, and therefore the lower its average costs are going to be. Now, if there's only modest or moderate scale economies, then that tends to suggest that there's going to be a larger number of firms in the industry. And one of the, I talked about oligopoly, but an oligopoly sometimes is known as, or a different form actually, is sometimes called imperfect competition, which is very similar goods, so not really differentiated. And sometimes that's called monopolistic competition. Here you've got a large number of firms competing. If and the bottom paragraph there in the PowerPoint kind of depicts what I was just talking about earlier, and that is where you get substantial internal scale economies, and then you tend to get a few large companies in the industry. Example of this would probably be the airline industry, where there are very few suppliers of aircraft, The US is a big producer, through Boeing and McConnell Douglas. Then you've got Europe with Airbus. Then you've got the Canadians with Bombardier. You've got a Brazilian producer as well, but basically that's it for the world. The Chinese are beginning to ramp up, but there's very few aircraft manufacturers. And that's because the scale economies are really, really considerable. Looking at outside of the firm, sometimes we see external scale economies, and they're based on the size of an entire industry within the specific geographic area. So the average cost of the typical firm producing the product in this area declines as the output of the industry within the area is larger. So when we get external economies of scale, when typically the clustering of the production of some products is done in specific geographic areas due to the specialized supply of resources. In other words, it makes no mistake. The reason why Silicon Valley in California is so dominant in the tech industry is simply because if you really want to be a top performing programmer, you go to Silicon Valley. If you want to be in the tech industry, that's where you go. It's pointless going anywhere else in the country because, Silicon Valley is where all the tech firms have their headquarters. So there are some economies of scale there in the sense that, if you're looking for staff, you only really need to look in that area because you know that anyone who's worth his or her salt in terms of programming or in terms of their tech skills is going to move to Silicon Valley if they want to work for one of those companies. And once you get a cluster, you tend to get greater communication between the firms within that specific geographic area, and constantly you get knowledge spillover. Another good example, by the way, tech is one good example with Silicon Valley. The other one, of course, is the financial services industry, which is, in the case of the US, New York. I mean, if you want to be involved in an investment bank, well, you go to New York. Well, you go to New York because of the clustering that happens there. And what's interesting is even when the cost of actually doing business in New York is incredibly high now, and particularly in having an office in Lower Manhattan where Wall Street is, firms still do it because the cost is worth it because of the external economies of scale benefits to being in that specific area. Now, with the Krugman model, what occurs is, and if you think about it, this is natural, what occurs is what we call intra-industry trade. In other words, up to now we've said that, country X will export cloth and import wheat. In other words, the specialization in one product. Now, that's not what we observe for the majority of developed countries. So in other words, with cars, for instance, the US manufactures cars, so does Japan, so does Europe. So why is that? Why does the US both export and import cars? Well, the reason is because this is really an imperfect competition industry. In other words, it's an industry where you do have economies of scale. So we both import cars and we export cars, and that is intra-industry trade. So that's the net trade for an industry is the difference between the exports and imports. Inter-industry means that, it's like what we have with the Ricardian model and the Hector-Olin model. We're exporting one product and importing a very different product. Intra-industry, we're both exporting and importing the same product.